was in New York and among editing friends and talking about these books that were being nationally published, and George Saunders' major novel and all that, and then the same editor said, "I have something else for you," and he handed me an advance copy of Sarah's this book, which is her fourth book, but the other three, as wonderful and well received as they are, I think haven't been sort of set out in the world, and maybe it's because the world is now the way it is that it's even more of a vital and necessary book. It's a book that the best part of this evening is you're going to get to hear her talk and read from it, because it's a book that explains itself and in its own telling, and descriptions of it, such as mine, usually come off sounding kind of obtuse or something, because it's very much about, in a time when we're trying to reduce everything to tweets or short abbreviated descriptions, that the actual experience of reading and thinking through the things that she broaches in this book, where she counters these two very interesting stories. One, the story of a man primarily and his family, and I believe there's people here from his family, who was a conscientious objector in World War II at a time when that was a fairly unique stand to make and take in this country, and it had consequence to it. And at the same time, in her teaching life, has a student who has been a guard. I mean, I think, however, he initially got into this, but he's been a guard at Abu Ghraib, and how one goes about countering and carrying the notions of what that fellow has been exposed to, and in a way that becomes even more part of her life, although we all were part of that by what we saw and what we witnessed happen then. So it's a book that meditates and really thinks through these things in a way that's, again, is part of what's important to be done. And it doesn't always leave you with these quick snappy ways of saying things, but it is a place of resonance and depth that is important. Sarah lives in Idaho, and she just said they're having their own smoke over there, so it's at this time we're glad she's over here. I will say also that I don't believe there's anyone here tonight, but a significant part of this book's life was that its writing, some of it, a good part of it, came at Hedgebrook on Whidbey Island, and you read the acknowledgments. Many writers have benefited from time and place and company there. It's mostly a place to sit and write, but there are others there. And in Sarah's case, all sorts of others were there. I think it even helped her moving this book into the world in the business ways as well as the writing of it. So it's a book that carries gratitude and respect in larger ways that are also good. So she'll read. I think she'll take some questions. And then in the back, she'll sign copies of this, and we have her other 3 books here as well. So with that, we thank you very much again for being here tonight, and now ask you please join in welcoming the wonderful writer that is Sarah Sentilles.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Thank you for coming. Rick Simonson wrote the first positive feedback that I got for this book. That was from someone that I didn't know and wasn't related to. And Andy, when my editor, Andy Ward, forwarded me his comments, I think I screamed and cried in a good way. His introduction is so nice. Usually when I get introduced, people just read the bio from my own website, which is always a little bit strange. And I'm just grateful to have a bookstore like this. I mean, what a tremendous bookstore. I've always loved to read, but when I first started teaching in college, I started teaching critical theory at a state school in California, and I lectured because that's what had been done for me as a student in college. My professors would lecture and I would take notes, and I thought it was pretty interesting. But my students were totally bored, and they were falling asleep. They didn't care what I was talking about. And I went home and I told my husband, my students are really bored. And he said, "That's totally your fault." And I was like, "Oh, I love you too, thank you." And then he asked me this question. He said, why are you teaching this material? And I had to think about that because I had loved to learn just for the process of learning. And it made me think really carefully about why I thought that the material I was teaching my students was important. And at that point, I realized I didn't actually care if they remembered anything that I taught them. What I wanted them was to learn how to think and how to read critically, and to kind of begin to discover the power of their own minds. So in this time, in this crazy news cycle, when the president we have is actually killing book sales. There was an article about how he's affecting book sales. Really, the most radical form of resistance you can engage in is to buy my book, I would think, and to read carefully. So I'm also grateful to be here because, like Rick said, this land is where the story began, the story of Howard and Ruane, and Howard's family is here. Two of his grandsons and his daughter and son-in-law are here tonight. I saw a photograph in the newspaper of Howard. He was a conscientious objector in World War II, and he protested the internment of Japanese Americans. There's actually a picture of his college roommate in the back room here, Gordon Hirabayashi. And in that protest, he was put in prison, and while he was in prison, he built a violin, which his grandson, Noel, played a role in helping it get finished. And so the photograph I saw was the violin being handed to him on his, I think, 87th birthday. Is that correct? And everything in my body just kind of lit up and said, you need to know this person, you need to write a book about him. And I'll read the beginning of the book in a second for what happened after that. But this book has a kind of magic in it. And it took me 10 years to write. I didn't have any idea that we would have the current president that we have now when I was writing it, but really the question driving the book is, how do you live a life of peace and principle? What do you do in the face of suffering that feels like it can't be stopped? And writing about Howard kind of suggested answers to me about what that might look like. You know, I don't know what you're feeling in our current political climate, but I feel pissed. I feel scared a lot of the times. And rage and fear, they move me to act, but a lot of times they exhaust me or paralyze me. And I think that despair is a luxury that people like me can afford while countless others can't, whose bodies are being more affected by the policies that this administration is putting forward. So I've been asking myself, how do you live a life of peace and principle in the age of Trump? And it seems to me that there's answers all around us. I mean, the three things that I guess drive this book are the idea that art making and art viewing have something to offer us, that they engage the imagination in a way that's not just about making things up, but about building something new and holding those creations up against the world as it is and offering a vision for what might be possible. I think that we can't build a better world unless we can imagine it first, imagine what it might look like first, and art helps us do that. I've been thinking also about the fact that I constantly refresh my news feed to see if maybe there's better news or different kinds of news I'm pressing it because that's what I do on my iPhone to get it to refresh the news feed. And I started thinking about, well, maybe I'm reading the wrong information. Sometimes I feel like the solution to the despair I feel when I read the news is just to turn it off or shut it down. But I've started to think that really what we need to do is a kind of strategic listening to the voices that came before. This isn't the worst time that people have lived through, and that there's voices on the margins that have wisdom to offer us. So I'm trying to switch my energy from the New York Times news feed, although if they review my book, I'll read it a lot more. And towards historical and contemporary voices that have insight about the times we're living through. And then Howard was a conscientious objector, and conscientious objectors refuse to use violence in the face of war. So I've been trying to think about what that might look like. What does a civilian conscientious objector look like? What does resistance look like in the face of the violence we're experiencing now, whether that's, the anti-trans tweets that get out, or anti-immigrant sentiments, or any number of racist, anti-environmental policies. Like, what does conscientious objection look like if you're not being drafted to fight a war? So this book started with the photograph of Howard that I saw in the newspaper, and then it had a second photograph at the heart of it, which is the photograph of that man standing on the box taken at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, covered in blankets and with a hood, with his body attached to electrical wires. I saw that photograph when it came out in 2004, and I was a graduate student at the time, studying theology, because I wanted to make a lot of money. So I thought that would be a good field to be part of. And I was writing a dissertation on theological imagination, on that idea that you need to be able to imagine a better world to help bring it into being. And I thought that religion had something to say about that. And when I saw that photograph, I realized I couldn't write that dissertation anymore. I was also in the process to be ordained as an Episcopal priest, and I couldn't do that either, I realized. So I wanted to think about images and images of violence and what's required of us when we see them, and how they're used to create this sense of others, an other, and to justify how they're treated. I taught at an art school for 5 years, and it was only when I started teaching at that art school that I realized how, and it might sound obvious to you all, but how visual oppression is, how we treat people based on how we missee them or how we see them. So I've been trying to think about that, like what do we do when we encounter someone that we've othered in some kind of way? We talk a lot about empathy and how empathy can enable us to act with compassion when we confront somebody who might be unfamiliar to us. But it seems to me we need something different than empathy. We need to know how to behave when we encounter radical difference, because empathy depends on being able to see some kind of sameness in the other person. And I think that art also helps us with that. If you encounter another being that you don't understand, for me, that's when you're encountering the divine in some way, that the radical other, which is how God is thought about. So the structure of the book, as Rick was talking about, it's a little bit strange. It's a collage. It's bunches of pieces put together. I wrote it first as a novel, and I wrote it all the way through as a novel, and then I had a friend who told me that it was terrible, as only good friends can do, and she suggested I write it as nonfiction, which is what my other writing had been. So I shattered the book. I really cut it into pieces and then tried to tape it back together to see what I could find there. But it seems to me an important form because there's lots of white space on the page, which is my invitation to the reader to animate the text and to decide what the images mean to her and what the pieces of information, what meaning she wants to make out of that information. I wanted it to be an invitation, not a polemic. I also think that kind of fragmented form is how we hear information in the world anyway. You might hear a story on NPR, then a lyric coming out of the car next to you, then some family story from a relative, and then the news, and then some terrible image, and we have to try to make sense of these things. So that was part of what I was offering. And then I was also very influenced by an artist named Fred Wilson, who made an exhibit called Minding the Museum at the Baltimore Historic Society, maybe a decade or more ago. And they gave him free rein with the collection. He's a black artist, and they let him kind of reorganize their entire collection. So he went through the basement and all the things that they've saved, and he put things together in these strange ways. For example, he put a KKK hood in a baby carriage, and there was these kind of racist statues of Native Americans, and he put them facing contemporary photographs of Native people taken by themselves. But there's one piece that really stood out to me, and it's called Metalwork. And it's like a display case, and it's filled with these intricate silver vases and goblets and wine cups. I guess wine cups and goblets are the same thing, but a bunch of beautiful silver objects. And then there are slave manacles next to it. And he just called it metalwork. And there's something about putting the slave manacles next to these beautiful vases that for me made visible the violence of slavery in a way that just having the manacles would not. Kind of made that link between how wealth and oppression and the control of bodies and violence against bodies are linked. So that's another thing that I was hoping that these juxtapositions in the book would accomplish, to make connections that would not otherwise be visible. So I'm going to read for a little bit, and then I'll open it up for questions. The man in the photograph holds a violin, deep chestnut, almost red. He laughs, luminous, looks right at the camera, violin in one hand and bow in the other, a blue and gray plaid shirt, a gold wedding ring lit up by the flash. His hair, what's left of it, white. It was Howard Scott's 87th birthday, the newspaper story said. His family threw a party at the assisted care facility where he lived in Lacey, Washington. His children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren came to celebrate. They sang. He blew out candles. Everyone ate cake. "We have a surprise for you," his grandson said, and handed him an instrument case. Inside was the violin. Not just any violin, mind you, I read in the paper, but a violin 60 years in the making. To make a violin, you need horses. You need elephants, cattle, tortoises, snakes, abalone, whales. You need lambs fed on dry mountainous pasture. You need mastodons dug from Arctic ice. You need trees felled in winter when their trunks are free of sap. Trees grown on a forest's south side in stony soil with little water, so they mature slowly, their trunks strong and branchless. To make a violin, you need war. It is said Antonio Stradivari's most beautiful instruments were built of maple sent from Turkey to Italy, intended for oars that would row Italian warships. Because they were often at war with the Italians, the Turks sent wood with uneven grain, wood they knew would crack and split under the weight of water. But when Stradivari saw the curved wood, he knew he could make it sing. People used to believe photographs captured something material from the person standing in front of the camera. They thought it worked like this. Sunlight bounced off the body and onto the photographic plate, and when that light traveled from body to plate, it carried a physical element with it, a trace, however small. Photographs were like icons, they thought, like the story about the woman so moved by the sight of Jesus falling under the weight of the cross he was carrying to Golgotha that she pushed through the crowd, past Roman soldiers to reach him. With her veil, she wiped Jesus' face. Some call her Veronica, a name that comes from the Latin words vera, true, and icon, image, because in return for her tenderness, Jesus granted her a portrait. On that cloth, in blood and sweat, she found an imprint of his face. I called information and asked for the telephone number of a man named Howard Scott in Lacey, Washington. "Hold, please," the operator said, and then a recorded voice told me his number. I dialed. The phone rang. A man answered. "I read about you in the paper," I said. "Don't believe everything you read about me," he said. I told him my name, explained why I was calling, asked if it might be okay for me to write about him. "Yes," he said. "Are you one of my students?" "No," I said. "I was also in Vietnam," he said. Something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "I'll send you a letter," I said. "I'll give you time to think about it." I hung up the phone and wrote him a letter. I put it in the mail. I waited for weeks, months, no response. I worried Howard had died. I called the number again. The phone rang and rang. The artist, Anne Hamilton, held a canister containing a strip of film inside her mouth and used her lips as an aperture to create each exposure. A mouth-held pinhole camera. To take a photograph of another person, she stood facing her subject, less than a foot away, her mouth open, both people looking at each other. Nothing between them, just Hamilton's open mouth. She said she wanted the part of her body where all song exists to also become her eye. I had nearly forgotten about the picture of Howard and the violin, about the letter I sent, about wanting to write about him, but then I heard a message on my phone from Kayleen Pritchard, Howard's daughter. Kayleen told me she'd just found my letter on her father's desk, buried in a stack of papers. She called right away. Months ago, she'd been going through boxes of her parents' files and letters. They'd saved everything: ration stamps, brochures, newspaper articles, letters to the editor. Her mother, Wherein, had died a few years back, and Kayleen wanted to put her parents' things in order, tell their story before it was too late, but she felt overwhelmed. I said to the universe, "I need someone to help me," she told me. "I need someone to write a book about this." That was on May 25th, Kayleen said on the phone, the same day you wrote your letter. Come see us. So I did go and see them, and that was 10 years ago. So it's pretty amazing to be here and to have that family in the audience here. I'm going to read a little bit about Manzanar, which is one of the internment camps that was in California on Highway 395. I don't know if people have been there, but it's in this beautiful part of the Sierras under the shadow of Mount Whitney, which is the highest point in the 48 states. 48. There's 50 states in it, but right, the highest point in the continental states. Just want to say I know that there are 50. And there also the bristlecone pines are there right across the way, which are the oldest living things on the planet. So it was very strange to visit this site and think about the great violence that was done there. In the book I write about how that land used to belong to the Paiutes, but it was taken in terrible ways, and then they ended up building Manzanar there. And when I first drove by it, I almost missed it because there was nothing there to mark the site. But now it's been built up, and there's a museum. And I want to read this part because I'm from Idaho. I'm not from Idaho. I grew up in Texas, but I'm living in Idaho now. And our governor and our attorney general, or states, whatever they're called, is one of those 9 people who are 2 of the 9 people who signed saying they'll sue Trump if he authorizes DACA, if he reauthorizes DACA. And I've been working with local people to try to support immigrants in our community. And there's something I think so eerie. I live in Haley, Idaho, which is very close to where the Minidoka internment camp is. And now Jerome, Idaho, which is south of me, is right near Minidoka. And they're considering leasing their jail beds to ICE and setting up basically a southern Idaho headquarters to start rounding people up. So this part feels especially useful as we think about how to protest those kinds of policies. Manzanar was officially called a war relocation center, but some people called it a Jap camp. President Roosevelt called it a concentration camp, and others referred to it as a solution for the Japanese problem, echoing the language of the Nazis. If making 1 million innocent Japanese uncomfortable would prevent one scheming Japanese from costing the life of one American boy, wrote syndicated columnist Henry McLemore, then let the million innocents suffer. Internees began to arrive in March 1942, when the camp was still under construction, 1,000 people a day, though their barracks still had no roofs, though they could lie down on their straw mattresses and see stars. There were 2 schools at Manzanar. A white woman volunteered to be a teacher there. She had very few supplies. She used butcher paper for a blackboard. "Pretend this is a Bunsen burner," she told her students, holding up nothing. They didn't have an American flag, so every morning in her classroom, students saluted an empty corner. One of Manzanar's 600 structures included what was called the Children's Village, the only orphanage in any of the 10 internment camps the United States built between March and October 1942. 100 children lived there. They had been removed from orphanages and foster homes on the West Coast. By September 1942, Manzanar held 10,000 people. It was the largest city between Los Angeles and Reno. I went to Manzanar a few years after my first visit, and there was more to see than just a pile of rocks. The National Historic Site now has buildings, parking lots, exhibits, films, signs, a driving tour, maps. Inside the rebuilt gymnasium is a scale model of what the camp used to look like. Former internees at Manzanar, the graduating high school classes of 1943, 1944, and 1945, spent thousands of hours rebuilding their prison. You can stand above the model and look down at the tiny buildings, rows and rows of barracks, trees, mountains. In the exhibit hall, there are wall-sized black and white photographs of signs hung across streets, taped to store windows, stapled on telephone poles, hung from front porches. We don't want any Japs back here, ever. Japs, keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Photographs of evacuation orders, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. Photographs of signs announcing evacuation sales, families selling everything they own, everything they cannot fit into the 2 bags allowed per person. Once the evacuation order was posted, people had only a few days to prepare. Whatever could not be sold would be given away. What could not be given away would be burned. Refrigerators sold for $5. People buried heirlooms and photographs. One woman stood on the street in front of her house, cradling a stack of delicate plates. She threw each plate to the ground, one at a time, until the stack was gone. People gave away their pets because they weren't allowed to bring them. They turned in their radios and flashlights and guns. Cameras were not permitted. In the photographs of crowds waiting to board buses headed for the camps, guards point guns at the long lines of people, not away from them. So right away, everyone knew the story they'd been told, that they were being moved to camps for their own protection, was a lie. The guards handed out rectangular tags, the kind you might tie to a gift or a suitcase, and ordered people to tag themselves. Everyone followed the instructions, wrote names, looped white strings through buttonholes, tied knots, and in the photographs, the day seems so quiet, I imagine the only noise you could hear was the rustling of those tags in the wind. There was a spirit of shikata ganai, the exhibit explains. It cannot be helped. The government called them dislocated people, called them the unwounded casualties of war. My mom bought me a really pretty flowered dress, and she told me to wear it to all my readings so people wouldn't think I was depressed, too depressed. I didn't wear it tonight, so maybe you think I'm too depressed. So I wrote my dissertation in graduate school on the torture photographs at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, trying to think through people were calling them crucifixion images, and I wanted to think through what work that narrative was doing. What does it mean to call these images of tortured, mostly Muslim men, crucifixion images, to lay that story of salvific violence on their bodies? So I spent a lot of time thinking about photography and visual culture and thinking about those photographs. Then when I was teaching in California, one of my students told me that he'd been stationed at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. And it was like one of those moments when something comes to life that you're not expecting to, like seeing an actor on television or something, but it was all real and it had always been real. But here was this body that had been at this place that I'd been studying for so long. And I told him that if he wanted to talk to me, I'd be happy to listen. He says that I said, "Come talk to me now," but I don't think that I did say that. So he came, and I was one of the first people who'd ever asked him about his time at war, and he'd been back for over 2 years. In the same way that Howard did, he really challenged my understanding of my own pacifism. I've been a pacifist for a long time. And I think in a way I thought that my pacifism let me off the hook, as if the wars that our country fights have nothing to do with me. But here was this student who had been there, who had gone to war. He had volunteered so that he could have money for school to come. He needed money to sit in the college classes that I was teaching. So what did that mean about my accountability and my complicity? So he and I are still friends, and I've listened to his stories, and he is the other person besides Howard that shapes this book. So I'm going to read a little bit about Miles, which is what his name is. The barred walls of every soldier's cell were covered with plywood to make them more private. I should say that they slept in the prison cells at Abu Ghraib prison, the American soldiers did. Though the plywood didn't reach the ceiling, so you could see the light in the cells next to yours, and you could hear one another. All the windows were blacked out with paint. Otherwise, snipers would be able to see right into the prison and kill you. Miles was friends with the guy in charge of supplies, so he was able to get Sharpies, even a good set of thicker felt markers. He drew images all over the plywood walls of the room: Spider-Man, Batman, characters from The Simpsons, his friends, other soldiers. On the door to his cell, he drew his own name, made it beautiful. When his tour was over, people told him to take the walls with him, that he'd want his drawings when he got home. But he couldn't imagine ever wanting any of it. He wants it now. Fayum portraits, images created thousands of years ago in beeswax and pigment on wood or linen in a town called Fayum, south of Cairo, were painted while the subject was alive, but when he or she died, the image was attached to the mummy and buried. The images ensured safe passage through the underworld. They worked like passport photos, identifying the person's body on his or her journey. Fayum portraits were images destined to disappear. What does it mean to create a painting the artist knows will exist only with the dead, in the dark? I've always been taught the job of the artist is to look, but in The Shape of a Pocket, John Berger insisted the Fayum artist had a different job, not to look, but to be looked at. The artist paints himself being looked at, he wrote. This is the contract between artist and subject, and it is an intimate one. The two of them, living at that moment, collaborated in a preparation for death. The subject addresses the artist, speaks to her in the second person singular, you, and the artist's reply, which is the painting itself, uses the same intimate voice. You, the one who is here. You, who will very soon, too soon, not be here. Miles's assignment was changed from fingerprinting new detainees to guarding prisoners in the yard outside the building. They were kept in cages, larger versions of what you might find at a kennel for dogs. The prisoners prayed 5 times a day on mats they were given, their voices beautiful. They knelt on the ground in rows, and the guards would be quiet while they prayed, and the prisoners returned the favor by being silent on Christmas. It was a sign of respect, Miles told me. In some of the cages were children, in others old men. Many spoke English, and Miles became friendly with them, joked with them to pass the time. Inta, the Arabic word for you. That's what the soldiers called every prisoner, Miles said. The soldiers who worked the yard kept their cigarette butts in a jar. Hey, Inta, one of the soldiers said to a prisoner one afternoon, guess how many cigarette butts are in the jar? If he didn't get it right, he'd have to spend 2 hours in the cage reserved for prisoners who were in trouble. A few soldiers brought the jar to that prisoner and made him write down his guess, made him dump out all the butts, made him line them up in neat rows in the dirt, made him count each one. So many things were funny there that aren't funny here, Miles said. Consider this sentence, James Elkins suggested. The observer looks at the object. It seems simple, even obvious, a given, but the sentence comes apart right away because it's built on the mistaken idea that the observer and the object are 2 different things. The beholder looks at the object, but the object changes the beholder. Therefore, the beholder does not look at the object. Or consider this sentence. The soldier kills the enemy. It sounds like a one-way gesture, but it's not, because the act of killing doesn't only change the person who is killed. The act of killing changes the killer, Elkins wrote. In The Body in Pain, Elaine Scarry put it differently. Every weapon, she wrote, has 2 ends. Calling other human beings Inta, calling other human beings you instead of addressing them by name, dehumanizes, creates distance between guards and detainees. But what if it had been Berger's you, the Fayum you, a way of saying to the people they were charged with watching, to the people who were watching them, both of us are destined for the dark. Let's see what time. So I think I'll just stop there and take some questions if you have them. Thank you. Yes, please.
Did you share Howard with Miles?
Oh, you mean in telling or in the book?
In telling.
In telling, I've told him about Howard, and he's read the book, so he knows about Howard. Yes, yeah.
Did you get a reaction from him?
Not really. Miles doesn't give me a lot of reactions about anything. He is very calm. He's a dad now. He has 2 kids, and he says his wife really loves this book because it told her things about him that she didn't know. But he's, he sends me pictures if he sees the book out in the world, and he's excited about it. But about Howard, he didn't really say much at all. In the version of the novel that I wrote first, I had them meet and become really close. So in my mind, they're very close, but in real life, no. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Anne?
Can you tell us a little bit about the process of taking apart the fiction and making the book as it is now? Like there was a lot you had to let go of.
Yes.
You unwrite and rewrite so beautifully.
Oh, thank you. It was hard, actually. I mean, as soon as I started writing it nonfiction, I knew that was right. But then I had this big mess to figure out how to make sense of, and I just had all these fragments. Like I had a bunch of fragments about art, and some about animals, and some about peace, and some about war, and then these 2 stories of Miles and Howard. And then I had this fictional version of a critical theory professor who taught artists in there that I had to deal with. But it wasn't until I took a writing workshop with Nick Flynn, who's a writer I really admire. I took a workshop with him at Tin House, and he had us bring in 3 things. We had to bring in an image, and I brought in that image of the Fred Wilson, the slave manacles and the silver. We had to bring in a science article, which I don't remember what I brought in. We had to bring in a piece of nonfiction that bewildered us, and I brought in Sarah Manguso's The 2 Kinds of Decay, which is also a magnificent book. And then he told us that everything that we were collecting had to do with our current project, and he had us do all this generative writing for the whole workshop and then read it to each other, which was both interesting and terrible because writing that you generate on the spot is usually terrible. But then on the last day, he had us bring in everything that we had collected, every image we'd collected, all the new writing we'd done, and he had us bring in blank pieces of paper, and we lined up the paper on the floor. You were allowed to line up 20 pages, and then you were supposed to cut up all the writing that you'd done, and we'd had to do homework at home, and then tape it together on to the blank pages, leaving space in between. And at first I taped it like super intensely, like I would tape every single little fragment with like 20 pieces of tape, which was missing the point because you were just supposed to lightly tape it so you could move it around. So we were all like sweating. It was so physical and empowering to see my writing that way, and it also forced me to see all the pieces that didn't fit that I really wanted them to. My boyfriend in high school, when we played gin rummy and you'd keep too many cards in your hand because you hoped you would get matches later, he called that romancing. And I realized I do a lot of romancing in my writing. I'm like, I really love this elephant passage. I want to jam it in somewhere, but it forces you somehow to, when you see that it doesn't actually fit. So he had us tape them down, and then you could do writing by hand in between. And something about that process like just unlocked what this book was for me. And so I did that probably 60 times in my own house. I would take a chapter and I would think it was kind of working, but then I would force myself to cut it up to see if it was actually working, and then I would put them back together, and it allowed me to see these connections that I couldn't see otherwise. And then the kicker is he made you retype the whole thing. So you have to recommit again to every single word. So it's very exhausting. He warned us, don't do this very often, but I did it like every week for about 3 years because I just found it useful. So that was what I did. But it means that I have like thousands and thousands of fragments in bags. That, the book is pretty short. It's, I don't know how many pages it is, but it's about 50,000 words. And I probably wrote, 1,000 pages or something that did not make its way here. So some people who aren't so keen on the form will say it's like stream of consciousness, and I'm like, it's pretty much the opposite of that. It's like it's taking a stream and cutting it into pieces and then taping it back together with like the Colorado River. That's kind of how it feels. So that's a terrible analogy, but anyway, that was what it was like. Thanks. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm curious about the violin.
What would you like to know about it?
You know, all those different things actually go into the violin.
Oh, the opening passage that I read? Yes, they do. It's all of the animals that are used to create a violin. You know, where you get the ivory and the different kinds of wood and pretty much everything that I read in that list has been used as a piece to make a violin. Not this particular violin, but a violin. Violins generally, yeah. Anything else? Yes.
How does this book compare to your other work?
It's much better. No, I'm just kidding. It's different. I'm very eclectic. I'm kind of a weirdo. You know, after college, I did a program called Teach for America and taught elementary school in Compton, California. And I do not like Teach for America at all. I think it's a terrible program. I think it's colonialist and racist. I shouldn't have signed that release form now in the back about the TV, but I'm not a fan of that. But I was trying to figure out, for my first book, Taught by America, I was trying to figure out my own encounter with privilege, with white privilege, and what it meant to be 21 years old, teaching elementary school in Compton to 36 students in a classroom with no books, which is what I was trying to do. So that's that first book. I mean, it's much more, it's portraits of my students that I taught. At Church of Her Own, I was trying to make sense of the fact that I wasn't going to get ordained. I was really frustrated with organized religion and the sexism and homophobia that I was encountering there. So I interviewed a bunch of women about their experiences trying to lead churches. So that's more of a interviewee kind of book. Breaking Up with God is closest to this one, and I had to fight to keep it as fragmentary as it is, Breaking Up with God. And that was me coming to terms with the fact of letting go of this old story that had given me a lot of solace, and trying to figure out how I was going to make meaning in the world without Christianity in some kind of way. And then this took way longer. It had much more magic in it. I was talking with Kayleen about the process of writing today, and I said, you know, sometimes you have to become the person that the book needs you to be in order to finish it, and that's how it felt. It felt like massive kinds of personal and emotional change went into creating this book, but I feel like I became a better writer by the end of it. One more question? Yes?
So how would one reconcile then the fact, one of the things as in art is that art itself has some violence in it. You have to destroy a tree. Mm-hmm. You have to grind up the seashells for the color. You need to rip the fabric apart before you put it back together. So even that image does violence in and of itself. So, and then you're also talking about this actual physical violence as opposed to violence through image.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you put those together?
Are you a painter?
No.
Oh.
I quote.
Oh, nice. There's a really cool quilting thing going on right now. I just learned about it today. You probably already know about it. By the same people that made the patterns for the hats for the Women's March. They made patterns for quilting squares that they're going to create a quilt as long as the border wall that Trump is proposing, and they're calling it a welcoming wall. So you may want to look into that. Well, I don't think there's any innocent space to stand. I don't think there's anywhere that any activity you can engage in, anything that is without violence. And that's one of the things I wrestle with in the book about pacifism, where in order to live, you do violence. I mean, everything you eat. You know, I'm vegetarian, but I've been learning that trees and plants can hear and they have memory, and it's like it's really a struggle for me. But so I guess that's the only way that I could answer it, is that there's nothing that you can make or do or think or anywhere you can go that doesn't have an impact on something, and often a negative impact. One of my teachers talks about the word humility, and in divinity school I really resisted that word because it was always used to basically tell women to be quiet or to tell people on the margins to be patient. But she defines humility as coming from humus, or humus, however what you call not hummus. I am vegetarian. Humus, is that right? Humus, is that the right word? That understanding that soil is connected to everything, that everything you do has an impact on everything else. And for me, that's a demanding thing to hold in your mind and in your life. But it also is why we need rigorous ethics and community that can help us evaluate the effects of what we do. And so I guess that's a kind of not a hopeful answer, but I don't think there's anything that you could do. Like, this book is probably made of trees that are way more beautiful and old than anything I could ever write. But my hope is that it will help people protect trees or something, or help people think about how they live on the planet. Well, thank you very much for one more question. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
How has, after writing the book, has it changed? You said there's immigrants in your community. How has it changed your involvement at home?
Yeah. That's a great question. One of my former students is in the audience, and my students used to be like, you show us a lot of terrible things. What are we supposed to do? And I kind of said, I don't know. But there was something about this election that made me realize, I do know what to do. And that I think there's concrete ways that we can work together to support the most vulnerable in our communities, however you define that. And I felt my despair, it comes back, but I felt it dissipate as soon as I started organizing with people in my community, which is small, to do concrete things to support families, like to get their, in where I live, they're taking wage earners away, taking fathers away. So families are left with no childcare, no money, no place to live. And so the group that I'm working with helps them find those things. And that feels important, as well as the larger organizing to do more systemic change. But there's something about concrete daily action that I find gives me hope. I do think art making is important. That I think there's something about, Elaine Scarry calls art fragments of world alteration, and says that they kind of show what's possible on a small scale to remind us what we could do on a large scale together. That I used to tell my students, the most depressing thing I can tell you is everything's made up. We make this world, race is made up, but racism is real. So that gives us a lot of power to make something better and more just, I think. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
Mother Earth will make you beautiful.
Diabetes is a huge issue out here with the Navajo, and there's several factors that play into it, but essentially the area is a food desert. There's limited access to healthy foods. People drive long distances to get to shopping centers.
There's like around 13 grocery stores on the whole Navajo reservation, and so there's a lot of people who are not getting access to fruits and vegetables, and so in that way we're just trying to address that for sure. giving people more access to fruits and vegetables. Another big concern is diabetes. There's a lot of statistics going around, but one I've seen has been like 1 in 3 Navajo have diabetes.
Yigo gardening is a community garden intervention aimed to increase fruit and vegetable intake among 2 communities on the Navajo Nation, Crown Point and Shiprock. We chose to do a gardening project because we wanted to increase access to fruits and vegetables, but we also chose that because we knew that that was very much part of their culture.
One of our traditional beliefs is Mother Earth is sacred, and that's where we teach them to take care of everything. Instead of telling them that, oh, you can just go to a store and buy it, like you can actually grow it and take care of it yourself, and that it can be done, and that we've been doing it for so many years before any of this new technology came in.
You know, we adults are kind of set in our ways, and it becomes a little more difficult to change behavior that's been set earlier, you know, earlier in life. And so, targeting youth and family, you know, we hope that it will foster greater adoption of healthy eating habits.
They love to get their hands dirty, and with any child, that's what they want, and that's why we're so fortunate that we get to have the opportunity with these kids and teach them that, so that they can take it home and teach the rest of their family. It's like a real good ripple effect, that it shows that the kids are eager to learn, and it's not the fact that they don't want to.
This project actually is being funded from the National Institutes of Health because of its potential in cancer prevention. And it's fairly well known that higher rates of obesity are associated with higher rates of certain cancers.
I guess I would just like to see us having the awareness of where food is derived from and how interconnected it is with health, to where we could, you know, actually overall be a healthier society. Really, things have to be done more in an integrated manner. It's not just a matter of like identifying a problem and then trying to come up with a single solution, because there is no single solution to it. It's multifaceted. So how do you bring in multiple disciplines to approach a problem, you know, from multiple angles? And that's what I think we have going here.
Gardening for my family is a family activity. When we do have a bigger garden, it seems like the whole group will go out and just walk among the plants, whether we're pulling weeds or just going through the cornfield. I notice the kids, they love to play in the cornfield, hide and seek, and they just get to see the bugs that are out there and learn about the ecosystem.
Here's gonna squish it. Ew. I know, it's going poo-poo.
There's a big possibility that the immediate parents of like the students at our facilities do not know how to garden, but then it creates connections to other members of the family, especially like grandparents who remember growing up having a garden, working on a farm, and kind of creating that connection and maybe dialogue to consider gardening again. And so, that sense, it does provide kind of like a cross-generational connections.
Whoa, whoa, make it stand up. There you go.
It's leaking water from that hole.
Yeah. Make a hand. Whoa, whoa, don't just put it in there. Don't treat it nice. Treat it like a baby.
We developed community garden plots, actual places central to the community where people could garden. And then we also had a series of workshops for community residents where they could learn basic gardening techniques, how to plant, when to plant, what to plant, how to do weeding, the right amount of watering. And we hoped that people would participate in the community garden, but also take those skills and use them in their own home gardens.
Remember there's that one picture of my grandpa's doing this?
Yeah.
What was he doing?
Hoeing.
What do you mean by hoeing?
Weeds. Taking out weeds.
So what's this?
Weeds.
Pull it out, pull it out.
Cancer is also a prevalent disease on the Navajo Nation as well, and so that's another thing that we're trying to address in terms of providing preventative care, and also kind of taking advantage of some recent studies that show that having a more healthier diet, not only do you get the nutrients, but the nutrients also kind of become like medicine, and so that helps as well to prevent, but also maybe even help one manage, if they have those diseases, manage those diseases as well.
Oh, sick, it went in my nose.
By gardening, you do get access to fruits and vegetables. You also get some physical activity. Also, in a kind of mental health aspect, there's a lot of research that talks about how gardening is a way to relax. And then, of course, the cultural aspect is probably the most important in that. By just kind of learning how the land works again, and how you interact with it, and seeing what ways work to grow your garden. That's another major link to Navajo beliefs and culture.
She is Aspen, you and I am Lilia. She is 6 years old and I am 8 years old. Yes. And our favorite thing about planting is getting our hands dirty. Yeah. And getting dirty. Yes. But after that, they tell us to clean up for lunch. Yeah.